Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for September 6th, 2024. I'm Benji Fisher moderating, and Ralph Kohler is sharing his screen. And also present is Thomas Howell. So small meeting this week, but let's have a look at this issue.
Okay, thanks, Benji. We are looking at issue number 3459246. Add a check all option for checkboxes element. Basically, what this issue does. One second, I also can share my screen, my installation. Yeah, again, the same credentials as always. Point is what this issue does. If you have a list field, in my case, I've created a list text field type. I went in and created the values for the severities that are outlined in the issue summary in here. As you can see here, with severities, emergency alert, critical error warning, notice, info, and debug. One detail I wanted to highlight, which I've noticed, one detail, because if we go now to manage form display with the patch applied, you now have, first you have to select the checkboxes radio buttons option. And then you have the option to show check all none button. But that brings me to one detail I've just realized while setting it up, which is out of the scope for this issue, but from my perspective, it's definitely valid for a follow-up issue, because at the moment, checkboxes and radio buttons, if both you have checkboxes and radio buttons, and therefore I was struggling figuring out how I'm able to check, because per default, I've set it to per default on the field settings, you have limited it. And that way, you get to radio buttons. And I was struggling how I'm able to switch over to checkboxes. But yeah, you have simply to change the allowed number of values to basically, or I could just demonstrate it, limit it to 1. If we go now to yeah, you have radio buttons, and if you change back to unlimited, you use checkboxes. And that is in detail that is not very apparent, nor there's any feedback in the description or alike within the UI. So I think that would be worth for a follow-up issue. But to the point that issue is providing, it is adding, as you can see here, a check all none button. If, for example, we have alert and critical checked, and you now check that button, everything is checked. If you check again, nothing is selected. If you check again, all is selected. Though that's the basic setup. Any questions to this point before I get to the list of problems, the research?
It seems like a pretty reasonable thing to me. And I guess being an experienced Drupaler, I'm familiar with why when it shows radio buttons and when it shows checkboxes. So, but yeah, let's leave that for a follow-up.
Yeah.
So, Thomas, any questions about the scope of this issue?
Nope, just comments, and I'm waiting for the commenting section.
Okay. So go ahead, Ralph.
Or Thomas, you could go first with your comments because mine are a bit extensive. So, and I'm quite opinionated about that issue. Meanwhile,
So Thomas, do you want to give your first impressions?
My first impression is that I definitely like this, but I'm not fond of where the checkbox is. Um, I for whatever reason, I would expect that to be an option on the page where I'm creating the list itself rather than being under the edit page, or at least in both. Like I'm not against it being under the gear for configuration. I kept on trying to look for it on that page, and so I would have put it where the edit page was. So when you're editing like for me, not like that's where it is. I'm okay with that as an additional place, but I would have put it where when I was actually editing the
field settings.
when you're actually creating the options, the
Yeah. You mean basically instead of on the manage form display widget, you would do it in here in the field settings?
yeah, okay, yeah. So yes, I would have put it on, like that's just where I was looking for it. Maybe in a perfect world, it would be in both places, but I know that's not the best design. But that way, like it is a configuration, so I'm fine with it under the configuration wheel, but I wouldn't have looked for it. I would have assumed it's here because I would have put it next to where the allow number of values is. Because especially since that chooses whether or not this is a radio button or a checklist, I would have put it there, and that way you could link it behaviorally. Like if you did select all, then you would have to have it as unlimited, and it would make sense that those two configurations were related to one another for me.
Okay, any other comments?
I like it. So, I mean, I'd love to have something that simple to add to a list. It's very, very Excel.
Okay, my first impressions are I disagree with Thomas. I think it is configuration of the form widget, so I think it's in the right place. Um, and I get a thumbs up from Ralph. And the only thing I would like to change about it is that I'd like to update the label on the button. So uh, when uh, when there's at least one unchecked, I would like it to be the button to be labeled check all. And when all the options are selected, I would like the label to be something like clear or check none. Um, so Ralph, you've looked at it more. What are your thoughts?
Yep. Yeah, I get to your point, Benji, at one point. I'll just go through my notes. First, the button has the same problem like all the other grayish buttons. It's a known problem. The button contrast has a too low. The button has a too low color contrast. It has 1.5 to 1, and it should have 3 to 1. Then more serious problem is that toggle button. I can demonstrate basically. Um, um,
VoiceOver on text edit, uxmeeting.txt, window, edit text, insertion at end of word, update, https:// www.
Are you able to hear the announcements?
Yes.
Okay.
Link, skip to main content, manage, toggle test, check all / none, button, severities, group. You are currently on the button. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space. VoiceOver off.
As you can see, the toggle button, it is not a toggle button, but the button state is unknown. There is no ARIA press. Plus, in addition, as you've mentioned, Benji, in addition, the microcopy gives no indication. It states with all checked, non-checked, covering both ends of the spectrum. Also, there's no visual indication if the button is pressed or toggled or not. And visually, there's also an intermediate state would be impossible, meaning if you have two checkboxes checked, to communicate that, it's impossible. And also the problem is it's that toggle button, the button label has the similar problem, like for example, the show password, hide password, meaning Leonie Watson is one of the WCAG chairs, and she is actually blind and a screen reader user. She said buttons that change the label on a toggle, it's quite challenging to know if it's, for example, that the button says check all and then switches to check none, meaning what is to be entirely sure what the current state is and what the future state pressing the button will be based on buttons that change their label is challenging. Instead, in regards of that kind of switch buttons, it's better to have a single button label, at least for screen reader users, that says check all, and then you get check all selected or check all non-selected. And that way it's entirely clear what the problem is. Another problem I see visually, for me, it feels like you have the button and then you have a list of checkboxes. It's visually, even though they're in close proximity, it's not entirely clear that those two belong together. It feels sort of disconnected. And technically, you would need a tri-state and an interface component that communicates that also to assistive technologies, and that basically, yeah, that at the moment we're looking at the tri-state, meaning not all checkboxes are checked while a few are. And I've taken, and on the issue, there was also the discussion or the question what the better choice would be, if it be a button or a checkbox for that, for that switch and that check all option. And Simo brought up a good point on the issue yesterday, on the subject of checkboxes versus button. An old issue has 9-year-old comment, number 60, is still valid. The functionality is already in core. It's just about applying this consistently across the UI, meaning if you go to content, you already have the option to check all. From my perspective, it does not directly apply because due to the fact that the checkbox here is within the table header, it's distinct from the rest of the checkboxes, and therefore it's communicated in sort of a way visually that has a different role than the ones beneath. And I went ahead and also looked for actual resources about examples in context of UX for that select and check all problem for checkboxes as well as for buttons. Problem is for buttons, for the check all button pattern, to be honest, I haven't really found one single example. While for the checkboxes, I found several. I post in the chat. Those are either Stack Exchange as well as Niels Norman Group and CSS Tricks and a few other UX design related best practice patterns, all referring to checkboxes. And the all checkboxes with child checkboxes is basically, I open one example. Let's pick the Niels Norman Group. The example is basically a nested checkbox list. which is the go-to, meaning you have the check in all and underneath indented the list of available options in here. All are checked, while here none is selected and here is some selected. There's also a few design systems that apply the same pattern. Carbon design system, the material, and Atlassian. And in addition to that, there's also, from an accessibility perspective, again, an article by Adrian Rosselli. Check all, expand all controls. As you can see, he isn't using the indented version. Then DQ University is also advocating for the tri-state. As you can see here. And the only odd example, the W3C also uses the indented pattern, but the odd pattern here is basically, if you can take a look at the moment, we select tomato and mustard. Now we click all condiments, all are selected. If you click again, none is selected. And if you click another time, tomato and mustard is remembered. That feels a bit odd, to be honest. But from my perspective, for that issue, personally, I would go be consistent with the content page on here, but indent the options underneath, and meaning apply the nested checkbox pattern and use basically the tri-state checkbox pattern as well. And on the other hand, the only addition I would make is, in case a single one out of three in this case is checked, I would make that also an intermediate state up here to communicate it as well. That way it would be consistent across core that way.
Okay, well, let me make a few quick comments and then Thomas has something to say. So first of all, Simo has joined the meeting. Hi, Simo. And I think you're already familiar with this issue. Second, one of the first things you said, Ralph, was something about the contrast on the button. And I think that's out of scope for this issue. That's the responsibility of the theme. And go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, I thought you had more to say. Are you done?
That's all I had to say for now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to put out there that I would see as a side issue adding an option to indent or not indent, but I don't like, because indentation implies to me hierarchy, and it works very well when you're talking about ordering food and you have several groupings and you may want to add and none those separate groups, but automatically indenting all the time without some ability to choose or not choose it, to me, I don't like it visually. And so I would hate to force that on people, because if they, yeah, I'm not fond of that. Stop there. Thank you.
About that indenting, I'm thinking, let's make it work in Stark and then leave the indentation to the theme of choice. That sounds sensible to me. But I think some sort of kind of, for most use cases, I think there is good to have some sort of distinction, but it could be also a line or something like that.
So I have a question. The issue mentions the table select, which I guess is what we've implemented here on the content page. Is that an option for any checkbox list? Checkbox list?
How do you mean?
If I have like the field you're looking at, so it's a list of text field. Is the table select, the thing we're looking at now, one of the options for displaying that? I think not.
Oh, you mean to bring the entire table pattern over?
Right.
No. That is the point I meant, why the pattern here isn't directly applicable to the where I am directly applicable to the example here. You can't put a table here. And that's the reason why I've suggested and either the indentation or, like Thomas said, or Asimo said, yeah, draw a line between the select all and the options and don't indent. Those would be options, but I wouldn't press the same pattern across all different contexts.
Also, if we want to look at different places where we have lots of checkboxes, if we look at the patterns page, if we look at the permissions page, then we definitely don't want a select all, or most likely we don't want a select all.
Right. That would be problematic. But that's a very specific use case with very specific problems. So we were looking at the issue, and I think it was your comment, Simo, that a very old comment still applied, that the pattern is there in core. It is the table select pattern, I think. And maybe instead of this, we should provide a one column table select as an option for select lists. And then we'd be using the existing pattern. So that would be a sort of a very different implementation, but it would be a way to solve this problem. So Ralph, what is your recommendation?
First, a question to your suggestion, but why does it have to be necessarily, even if it's just a one column table, why would it have? Yeah, it would be consistent that way, but from my perspective, I would simply replace the button with a checkbox and either indent it or add a separating line in between that, select all checkbox and the list of available options. And also add the try state. That would be my suggestion.
Okay, so adding the tri-state would be, similar to my initial suggestion that I just said that the button text should change depending on what it does. And a tri-state button would be probably a better solution than that. Do we have that tri-state button anywhere else in Drupal?
I don't think so. And that's also the point. If the tri-state gets introduced, I would make that button here as well a tri-state. If at the moment it's unchecked, but at the intermediate state for that table header as well.
Right.
But that way it's the only way that it's in particular for assistive technologies and screen reader users, it's the only way that is clear in
So
communicating.
if we were to follow my suggestion and provide a one-column table select as an option for as a form option for any list of text field, if we were to follow that suggestion, then we could have a follow-up issue to improve the table select by adding a tri-state to the select all button. And then that would affect the content page, and it would also affect anyone using the new option on their list of text fields. I guess alternatively, we could introduce the tri-state button here and then have a follow-up issue to add it to the table select. Presumably there's a reasonable amount of JavaScript that you have to add to enable the tri-state option. Go ahead, Ralph.
Just one question. Let's say we would implement the single column approach, but isn't it in the oral interface potentially confusing if you have just a single? Oh, yeah, technically it's not much of a difference to that over here, but still, I'm not sure if it wouldn't be confusing. I'm not sure. And how would you visually present that single column? Because if it's a table, it would have to be styled as the table as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and it would not actually be a one-column table. It would be two columns, one column for the checkbox and one for the label.
Hmm. I'm not sure.
So your recommendation is to replace the button with a tri-state checkbox with the label select all.
Yeah. And yeah, in addition to that, communicate in some way, either with indentation or, like Simo said, a separating line that the select all refers to basically the options underneath.
Yeah, so
Cliff.
I'm looking at a user interface that's familiar to many people, Gmail, which basically has a tri-state checkbox with no label, although it does have additional options with a drop button that you can select all, none, red, unread, starred, or unstarred. And it does have the behavior that when some are selected, clicking once selects all, and then clicking again selects none. No, I take it back. Clicking once clears, and clicking a second time selects all.
Oh, the other way around.
Yeah.
Oh, indeed. That also feels odd.
Sorry, what?
That also feels odd that it's deselects everything in the first step.
Yeah, I can't see it as a big difference from usability because, you know, once either all are selected or none are selected, it becomes a simple toggle. So seems to me that it would work equally well either way. I certainly don't want to suggest that I know more about usability than the designers of Gmail. They've obviously put a lot of thought into it.
But nevertheless, if you take a look at the drop button, you have the options all, non-read, unread, starred, and unstarred. And I would assume that the first option on top is the default one. But instead, the second one is the default and the option of choice.
Good point. But we're not suggesting anything that complicated. Certainly not for what started out as a simple list of checkboxes. All right, so we have a few options. One, keep the button and maybe make these implement the suggestion I had at the start, which is to change the label on the button to indicate what it will do. Second is to replace that button with a checkbox. Third is to replace that button with a tri-state checkbox. Fourth suggestion is, instead of enhancing the checkbox list, provide the table select as an option. Any other options we should consider? So is anyone in favor? Oh, go ahead, Thomas.
My only concern about voting right now on your table option is for myself, I feel like I have insufficient information on what the consequence of that choice would be. So it's slightly different than the other choices. I think it's intriguing. It's an interesting option, but I'm worried I can't make a good determination because I don't know what the effect of doing that might be.
So Thomas, could you go back to the form configuration?
Here or the
No, manage form display. So yeah, what I'm thinking of would be in the checkbox, not in the configuration, that we'd add another option So can you cancel this? And then in the checkbox where you have either select list or checkboxes and buttons, you'd have a third option, which would be table select. Maybe we would use a different label for it. And then if you choose that option, then the form widget would be a lot like what we see on the content page. Thomas, go ahead.
I like what you're describing. The only tangential question that continues to bother me is why are checkboxes and radio buttons combined when we have a select here where we could actually select checkboxes or radio buttons separately? So like if we're adding the table option, it just confuses me why we wouldn't explicitly put this here to choose between things rather than implicitly choosing it by how we configure something that doesn't directly relate to checkboxes and radio buttons.
Yeah, so I don't think that's in scope for the current issue, but I think the reason is that it's to prevent you from making an inappropriate choice. So radio buttons are appropriate when only one thing can be selected. And if you can select more than one, then you should not be using radio buttons. So I think it's a very reasonable adaptation.
Oh,
Right, but
go ahead. Go ahead.
You first, Ralph, please.
I just noticed something that should also be noted is the point. As you can see, I went to the field settings and I switched to limited. So we get back to the radio button pattern, and still, if we go under severities here, the show check all non-button option is still there. Shouldn't it be hidden in that case?
That was one of my concerns. Like when I was getting into that earlier, it's you're configuring things in two different places and the labels aren't necessarily changing. And to me, that ends up being confusing. And I understand how the intention is to block us from making incompatible choices. But I feel like we've got two places both affecting the same thing, and it's not necessarily in sync. And to me, there's a cognitive load to have to click between these places to make certain that I'm doing everything right.
Yeah, so the way the Drupal content model works, the Manage Fields tab describes basically the database structure for the field. And then the Manage Form Display describes how we present that to admin users. And we could use a select list in one context and checkboxes in another. So I think that's just the way Drupal works. I agree that we should not be presented this option for fields that only allow one selection. But I think we should, go back to the choices I listed. So one is to keep the existing implementation with a button, and make some tweaks to it. Second is to replace that with a checkbox. Third is to replace it with a tri-state checkbox. And fourth is to sort of abandon this implementation and instead provide the option of a table select. Now, the second and third options, I would say, the tri-state is definitely preferable to the simple checkbox, but we might suggest the checkbox as an intermediate stage, a first step. Thank you, Ralph. Does anyone think that the first option is what we should recommend? I don't see anyone voting for that option. And I think, Ralph, you still recommend the third option and perhaps the second option as an intermediate step?
To be honest, I wouldn't go with an intermediate step 2. I would directly go to 3 if possible.
Okay.
I would go with intermediate step. If we can also find a common solution so that we could have the tri-state checkbox also in content list, and to get that checkbox or to get that select all, select none to other places as well. So kind of depends on how quickly this one moves, but I would like to have in admin content also multi-state.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. It's sort of incremental improvements. We agree on the end state being the tri-state. Oh, sorry about that. We agree that the goal is to have a tri-state button, but we also want the tri-state button in other places, and it might make more sense to fix this issue with a checkbox and then have a follow-up issue that introduces the new pattern of the tri-state, introduces the new JavaScript for the tri-state, and applies it to both table select and this. And does anyone have any love at all for my suggestion of providing table select as a different option? No one likes that one. All right. It has the virtue that it's reusing existing patterns, but if no one likes it, then no one likes it. Then, Ralph, do you want to argue against the sort of the two-step using a simple checkbox as an intermediate stage?
Not necessarily. I'm on second thought, I'm sort of fine with it if basically the follow-up issue is created upfront, and that is then synchronized with, for example, introducing it as well here. So it's probably fine and doesn't make much of a difference if first we go with 3 and then have a follow-up issue for adding the tri-state to the content page, or the other way around. First, get the checkbox in for with example 2, and then get the tri-state for both of for all the applicable cases. So it doesn't make much of a difference.
Okay, and then for this initial step, do we want to make a recommendation for the label of the checkbox? Is it simply select all and the label doesn't change?
Yep, from my point of view.
Okay, anything further to say on this issue?
One question, select. So the label should be select all. The suggestion should be button label. First variant 2. follow-up for Tri-State for this issue as well as admin content. And the question I have is, should we also create follow-up issues for the underlying problem, meaning that if the number of allowed fields is set to 1, that checkbox shouldn't show at all. So it basically is that the field widget here becomes sort of context sensitive, what the field settings are.
Yeah, I would say that should actually be fixed in the current issue, not as a follow-up.
Okay.
Anyone agree, disagree? I mean, that seems like a bug to me. So the pattern in Drupal is always you define the field and then you choose the form widget for it, and field definition gives the cardinality. If the cardinality is 1, then don't provide this option.
But would it make sense then that, okay, that should go in this issue, but would it then make sense basically to adjust the name of the option, meaning if the cardinality is 1, then it is radio buttons as the option. If the cardinality is bigger than 1, then it's checkboxes?
Seems out of scope. I'm familiar with how it works, so I don't really have a strong feeling, but I do
Not
think
in
it's out
this
of
issue.
scope.
It's totally as a follow-up issue.
Okay.
Completely out of the scope for this. I just meant if a recommendation should be made for a follow-up issue to make it context sensitive.
So either show checkboxes or show radio buttons.
Yeah.
Don't show checkboxes / radio buttons.
Yep.
I don't feel strongly. If you want to open an issue, go ahead.
Okay.
Thomas?
I would probably not like to see that, simply because for new users, if it only showed 1, unless initially it showed both and then it changed. So I don't know what the exact behavior that this follow-up issue would describe. But if, for instance, you created a field as today's administrator and you made it so that it used checkboxes, if I came in later to as an administrator 1 month from now and you were gone, if I didn't know how this worked, I wouldn't know that I could get to the other state by editing on that other form. Like, so the dropdown would only present me 1 option, and then I'd spend a lot of time researching it. So I worry for newer users, it's a confusing pattern to change this. So that's my only caution.
Okay, you got a thumbs up from Ralph. Okay, Ralph and Simo, you've both already commented on the issue. Would one of you like to add a comment with the group's findings?
Yeah, I could.
Okay, thank you. We have almost 10 minutes left. Do you think we have time to look at another issue? Well, let's at least have a quick look at the issue that Stephen Musgrave brought up.
The title formatter?
Yeah. So I haven't looked at it yet. Has anyone else?
Yeah, I have 1 second. I have the catch up light.
Oh, thank you. So for the sake of recording, this is issue 3470497. add a title formatter.
Yeah.
And it's split from another issue, 3033301. Add formatters and other mechanisms as alternative to base fields directly in entity templates.
We have we have to add a plain text field. The patch is applied, by the way.
I have to drop for a minute. Go on.
Display. Yep. And it's adding the option of a title in here. And you have the option, a checkbox called link to the content, and the option to set a tag. H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, or a div or a span. Let's say we pick an H3, and we check that. We update and save. Now we get into test. This is a test. Save. And if we go now to the front end, we still have the label. And if we go in here, it's an H3 wrapping the link for this is a test. And it's basically linking to the same node, which is a bit odd. What's the benefit of that? Any questions, or should I test anything?
So among other things, this lets you format the title as same as you can choose a formatter for any of the other fields.
Yep.
So on the
I
managed display.
Oops, I managed display exactly. If you go in here, the option for title is added. Let's hide the label. And for title, and you have basically the option, link to the content, the checkbox, as well as tag. You're able to choose that is wrapping that plain text field. And you have the option span, div, and H1 to 5. As you can see here. At the moment, it's wrapped in an H3.
So that would be useful for some kind of a list of cards. But then again, if it's a list of cards, each card would be probably a separate article that would have H1 level header heading.
So if you have a list of cards, doesn't it usually make the title an H2? I think it only uses an H1 on the main node page.
If they are rendered as articles, they can have their own h1s. So if it's a different context, so you can have h1 in like several h1s if they are in a different context. So if it's a different section, then it can be. But without the link, yeah, I can see that if you would want to build some content from PCs, let's say, yeah, since we always use umami, you could have a recipe with ingredients, and each ingredient could be its own content, and then it could kind of in that kind of if it would render each ingredient from a node into another page, then it would make sense to have different heading levels. So yeah, so that kind of, I think there are use cases for it. It doesn't add a lot of complexity.
Okay, and of course, Ralph is only showing us the managed display for the default display mode, but you can have as many display modes as you want, teaser, card, whatever. And you might choose different headings depending on which display mode you're using. And then if you're building a list with views, you can choose which display mode to use. We just have a minute left. And I just wanted to get a look at this issue. I didn't think we'd have time to come up with recommendations, but go ahead, Ralph. You can finish us off.
Just one thought in regards of the heading. I'm not sure if it's technically possible, but at the moment, you are able to explicitly set the heading level, but why instead not simply say span div and heading, and then let basically Drupal or the render array decide which would be the appropriate, because basically the fields that come before. You have links, you have severities in that case, but for example, if you have a body field, then you also know if there are any headings, and then you set basically basically set it automatically, but I'm not sure if it would be viable or possible, but that way that it ensures basically that you have no gap. So that you, for example, if the only heading in that node is, for example, in H1, and you set it to H3, then you have a gap between H1 and H3, and that way, or maybe add a warning, not sure.
Yeah, that's a big problem in Drupal, is getting the heading levels right. And I think that's out of scope for this issue. And I have some ideas how you could fix that, but we're already a minute over time. But thanks for presenting this second issue. Any last words? Okay, I'll be back next week. Hope to see you then. Thanks for coming.
Last weekend.
Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.